Welcome to the Profile Corner. In today's video we'll be creating blade carriers for two dado stacks. One of those is the Woodpeckers dado stack, which came in a cardboard box. I've got that here with me. And the other dado stack we'll be creating a carrier for is the Freud SD508. Which also came in a cardboard box rather than a plastic case, as was pictured on Amazon. I have here in front of me two stacks of black walnut boards that we'll be using. These measure 10 inches long and 3 3/8 inches wide. And what I'll be doing is I'll be putting box joints on the ends of these boards. I'll be using a table saw with a Woodpeckers dado stack to make 3/8 inch wide box joints. I have not tried creating box joints with that particular dado stack yet. I did measure the dado stack and it measured exactly 3/8 of an inch wide with two outside blades and one chipper installed. So that's good news. This is an example of a box joint that we'll be creating. This was created using the Forest dado stack, and as you can see here on the back side, we tend to get a little bit of blowout. I created this several months ago, and this is just essentially a test sample of what the box joints look like. So we'll be using a jig on the table saw that I use for dado stacks. The jig looks like this. It's based on a design that I saw in an Ask This Old House video. It's not exactly the same, but it is very close. I believe the only change that I made was to make the front fence here taller than the back fence, which would then allow me a place to put my thumbs when I'm holding onto the boards. So that's convenient. So one of the dado carriers will be created using that table saw with the dado stack. Another set of box joints will be created here on the PantoRouter using the new PantoRouter 3/8 inch wide box joint jig. And so we'll be able to test this out. I have not used this yet for creating box joints on the PantoRouter, so it may be a little bit interesting to see how well that works. Okay, I'll move the camera over to where my dado saw is at, and then we'll get started cutting these box joints. I'll put a link to the Ask This Old House video where this jig was shown in the video description so that you're able to find it if you're interested in creating a jig similar to this. It's a rather simple design. I set it up so that these oak runners are ever so slightly above the table surface, which means that this plywood is going to be riding just above the surface. That's one small change that I made compared to the Ask This Old House video. Okay, so I've got the stop set up here, and what I'll do is I'll separate out the boards into two different stacks. Because this board is 3 3/8 inches wide, I should end up with a similar pattern on both sides of this board with a full pin. I could run two of these at the same time. However, I'm not certain that this pin that I've got in the front is straight enough to be able to do that. It does look like it's bowed out ever so slightly, and so I don't want to take the chance that it's going to be off. I used this board here to make sure that the height of the dado stack was correct, trying to take into account the minor bat wing that's going to show up in the corner. So I went ever so slightly above the height of this board. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. test fit and see if they fit together. Okay, it does fit together. It's ever so slightly loose, and it could be just something here with using this blade instead of using the forest blade. It's ever so slightly different. I have to use a little bit of sawdust to try to fill in that gap. I've got it set at exactly the right height so that these pins do not stick out from the end of the board. So that's what I was trying to achieve. Okay, so now we'll cut the other ends. Now to cut the other two boards, what I'll have to do is I'll have to take one of these boards and set it here so that it pushes this board over by 3/8 of an inch. And then I'll make the cut on both ends. Same on the other board. Okay, now I can remove this board and then finish up the pins. All the boards are cut now, and something happened here with my measurement. I wasn't supposed to end up with that little bit of a sliver there on the end. I'm not sure exactly what happened there. It may be just something to do with this design, but I'll probably end up cutting that off later on. I'm not sure that the PantoRouter can keep up with the pace of this particular jig when creating 3/8 inch box joints, but it may end up working out. Let's see how they fit together here. Okay, that's a nice tight fit. Okay, so we should be okay then to move on to the next step. Okay, what I need to do next is verify that I cut all the way through these by test assembling the box joints, and I see I've already got a problem here in that this cut right here was not cut far enough through. So I'll have to go through and double check all those, and I'll touch up the ones that were not cut through far enough. And then we'll go over to the PantoRouter and cut the box joints there. Okay, at the PantoRouter here, I have all the box joint templates set up on the template holder. Their exact position doesn't really matter that much, although I did try to center the entire set of 8. I have the 3/8 inch router bit mounted into the router backwards so that the shaft is sticking out, so that I'm able to set this fence so that it touches that router bit. That's the first step in determining where the fence should be set in relation to the location of the first template that's up here on the template holder. So now what I need to do is remove the bit and turn it around, and then I'll be setting up the swing stop to set the distance that the boards will be held out in front of the table. I don't have the small swing stop adapter. I'm not sure what happened to it. I've got it here in the shop somewhere, but I'm not able to locate it. So I'll have to have these boards sticking out a little bit further than necessary, but that's okay. Okay, now if I bring this up, it should not touch the fence. There we go. So it is able to come up. For some reason, it is making contact with the fence. Okay, so I'm going to ignore what the documentation says, and I'll just have the router bit sitting mounted in this way, as the directions that were provided by the manufacturer don't seem to be working with this router bit. So I'll bring the router forward, set the fence, rotate the router bit, and there it's just barely making contact with the fence. Okay, so that's in the right position then. So now what we can do is swing this follower around so that the opposite end is sticking out, and it'll go right into the center slots. Okay, that's set. Now I'll set the swing stop in position, and what I should be able to do is just butt the boards up to that, and then every time I go to set in another board, it should come back to exactly the same spot. Now we can secure this board to the table, move the swing stop out of the way, and now we need to set the depth of cut. I need the depth of cut to be exactly 3/4 of an inch, so then I'll use a setup block that measures 3/4 of an inch with the front stop here. I'll set the back stop in position with the router bit touching the board here. Okay, so the depth of cut is set. Now what I can do is I can install the dust collection brush, which is going to make it a little bit hard for you to see what's being cut. However, that'll make it so I don't have chips flying all over the place. So that should work out well for me. Okay, so I've got the template holder height set so that if I have to come up from the bottom, which I will have to come up to minimize chip out, I'll have a portion of the template here to help me. Actually, I'll drop this down ever so slightly there so I have a little bit more. Okay, so that looks good. I need to get started with a cut. End for end, keeping the same side against the fence. Now I'm ready to make the next cut. This board is done. Now we're ready to do the next one that's going to be identical to this one. Okay, so now that we've got that cut, what we'll need to do is set up an offset for the other two pieces to be cut. And to do that, we'll use a 3/8 inch setup block. Before I get out that setup block, I want to just test the fit here. Here you can see we've got a little bit of fuzzy left over. And let's see if it goes together nicely. Well, that definitely is a much tighter joint than we were getting at the table saw. I'll have to hammer that together probably to get it to go, but it looks like that's going to be perfect. Let's see if the depth of cut is right. Okay, the depth of cut looks like that's going to be good. I only pushed it in this way, not the other direction. But there you can see that it is exactly lining up. So the depth of cut is great. So now we're ready to cut the other pieces. Yeah, I've got a 3/8 inch setup block here that I'm just going to set against the fence. And I'll be leaving it there. I have to move the swing stop to account for the 3/8 of an inch. And that's just as simple as loosening it up and then sliding it back into position. And now we can clamp the board down. Okay, we're ready to cut. Yeah, I was initially concerned that there'd be too much flexing in this whole assembly if I take off a full 3/4 of an inch depth of cut with a 3/8 inch wide router bit, but there was no issues whatsoever. This router bit came from Woodpeckers. It's being sold on the PantoRouter website with this particular kit for creating the 3/8 inch wide box joints. So now we've got all 4 pieces cut. We should be able to assemble these without any issues. It's going to be an extremely tight fit, which may be ever so slightly too tight, but we can work with that and try to make it work out for us. I think that this approach was actually a little bit easier and maybe even a little bit faster than doing it at the table saw. I don't see a whole lot of chip out here, which is great, and I think that's because we came up from the top and also from the bottom when we were making these cuts. So the joints all look pretty good. Now what I need to do is to create a mortise and tenon joint that goes through the center here over to the other side so that I can have a support piece in the middle similar to this Blade Runner design, except that I'm going to only have one board going across, whereas they have 2 plastic pieces going across. I'll be using the PantoRouter to do that mortise and tenon joint. If you don't have a PantoRouter, obviously you can use other methods to create mortise and tenon joints, and I may cover the various different methods for creating mortise and tenon joints in a later video. Okay, so I'm going to get the PantoRouter set up for doing that mortise and tenon joint, and then I'll bring the camera back. This board measures 2 inches wide and it is 9.5 inches long. I'll be putting a tenon on the end of this board, on each end, so that it'll fit into the sideboards of the Dado stack carriers. So I've got a location marked out on here that you probably won't be able to see, but the center line of this board needs to be 1.25 inches from the bottom edge here up. And so what I've done on the PantoRouter to accomplish that is I put a 1, 2, 3 block into here, and then I have on top of that a 1/2 inch setup block, and then the template holder is sitting on top of those 2 setup blocks. And so if you add those 2 together, that's 2.5 inches. And of course the PantoRouter has a 2-to-1 reduction ratio, so this 2.5 inches becomes 1.25 inches down here at the router bit. So it should be centered at 1.25 inches. I'm using the vertical clamping jig of the PantoRouter half-blind dovetail solution because it has a fence on the side here. I set the normal black fence that's down here to be 5 inches from the center line of the table, which means that the edge of this fence on the operator's side is exactly 5 inches from the center line of the fence. And so what that means is that with this template centered on the template holder, this mortise that gets cut into here will be centered in this board side to side. I have the depth of cut set to 9/16 of an inch, which means that I'll be cutting this tenon a 1/2 inch long on each end. And so that extra 1/16 of an inch will allow some space for glue to go. I figured out that I need to have the location of that board exactly where I've got it by using this setup here. I have roughly 1/4 inch from the end of this bolt to where this nut is at, and then between the 2 washers here is 3/4 of an inch, and then of course I've got another nut here. This bolt will be cut off at about 3 3/8, or slightly less than that in total length, which will allow enough room here for the other portion of the dado stack that includes the chippers to reside on the shaft. Okay, so now I'm ready to get started with a PantoRouter cutting the mortise. Okay, the first mortise is cut. Let's take a look at it here. That should work out perfectly. So now I'll cut the second mortise. Okay, the second mortise is cut. Now what I'll do is I'll cut the mortises for the other set of boards for the second dado stack carrier. Now I can take this vertical clamping jig off the table, and then we can set up for doing the tenons on the ends of the boards. I'm set up for cutting the tenons 1/2 inch long, and so what I've done here is I've used one of these boards up in this area here to set the height of the template holder to 3/4 of an inch, which means that with a 2-to-1 reduction that'll actually be 3/8 of an inch down here on the board, and so that's effectively going to center this tenon up and down on this board exactly. I set the depth of cut to 1/2 inch, and then I'm using a 22mm fowler up here on the outside of the template, and then I'll just use that to run around the outside and trim away the tenon material here. Okay, so we're ready to get started. Do a quick test fit and see if it fits into the slot. See if it fits into the mortise. Okay, it's ever so slightly too large, which is what we want. And now I can just make a very small adjustment up here on the bearing to pull it a little bit further out from the template holder. And now I can re-trim it. Okay, retest. Okay, so that's going to fit on there pretty tight, and I think that that'll work for us. It'll be a nice tight fit. So now we can do the same thing on the opposite end of this board. Another real quick test fit. Okay, that looks good. And now we can go on to the next board. Okay, so here's the test fit up, and the tenon is fitting in there just as we had hoped that it would. So what I'll have to do now is drill a hole through the center, either 1/32 or 1/64 less than a ½ inch in diameter. Very likely I'll go with 1/32 less in diameter, and that way I can thread this ½ inch bolt through the center of it, and then I can nip off this other end using a saw or a cutoff wheel on an angle grinder. And we also need to come up with a way of attaching these shims that would be used with this. And so what I was thinking is that on the other boards that go across, I could have the shims just set down inside. We've got a slight problem in that these shims are actually wider than our these boards here going across. As you can see right there, it'll end up sticking out. So that may present a little bit of a problem for us that I'll have to try to come up with a solution for. The shims for the Freud Dado stack are much narrower than are the shims for... I drilled the holes through the center of the support pieces using a 15/32 inch drill bit. Next, I'll get the PantoRouter set up to cut out a handle hole in the top of the Dado stack holders. I am set up to cut the handle in the first of the top pieces of the Dado stack holders. I have the vertical clamping jig from the half-line dovetail solution on the PantoRouter, and I'm using a little bit over 1/8 of an inch thick oak boards in the back here, so that'll allow me to plunge this ½ inch bit all the way through, and I'll be able to touch this oak board in the back without damaging the jig. So after I use this ½ inch bit, I'll switch over to the other board that'll be used as another top board in a Dado stack holder, and I'll make the cut in that, and then I'll swap over to a larger router bit, and then I'll repeat the cut. I have the slot mortising template up here on the template holder, and what I've done is I put the stop on each end just outside of the end of this template. So that should allow me to have the full run all the way across for a nice wide handle hole. Dust brush is apparently causing some problems with the clamps, knocking them out of position. I don't like that, but we'll work with that. So that cut all the way through. As you can see there, we've got the little bit of a problem right there that we'll have to try to deal with later on. Okay, so now we'll switch over to the larger router bit, and we'll make the handle hold a little bit larger. And that cut did not go all the way through, but that's okay, we can work with that, and we'll make some adjustments to it. I now have a 1-inch diameter router bit mounted into the router. This was supplied with a monster bearing kit, and I've reset the depth of cut so it should just barely scratch this 1/8 inch thick oak that I've got as a backer when the router bit plunges all the way through. I will not install the dust brush because I'm afraid that that's going to interfere with the clamps again. Let's make sure I've got the clamps down tight. Okay, so here's the through cut, and that should work out real well to allow me to carry it pretty easily. And there's the second one that's been cut all the way through. So that should work out. And now we just need to cut off the ends of those bolts to the correct length. And I want to make them somewhere between 3 1/4 and 3 3/8 inches long, possibly on the shorter side of 3 3/8, so that they don't stick out past the edge of the board that forms the sides of this dado stack holder. Now I have the blue tape located 3 5/16 of an inch from this other end, so that'll help me guide where I need to use this grinder with the cutoff wheel. is the one that I cut a few minutes ago. I'll have to likely run both of these nuts through this other end to reset the threads that are on this end. And I may need to clean that up on a regular grinder as well. Okay, so now I just need to chase those threads using the nut. Okay, so that one should be good. If I can get the nut back on now. Okay, the nut goes back on. Let's do the other one here. Okay, so that one should be in good shape too. So now we just need to thread these into the center supports that'll be going into the Dado stack carriers. I have the PantoRouter set up to cut some dowels with a 1-inch custom guide bearing installed into the PantoRouter. And what I'd like to do is to create some special dowels that are 5/8 of an inch on the one end and 3/8 of an inch on the other end, so that I can use those to hang these Freud shims for the Dado stack. I can hang those inside the carrier at the bottom, and I'm thinking if I make it so that the top of the dowel is 5/8 of an inch and the inside is 3/8 of an inch, then that'll allow those shims to kind of stay in place once they get put in place. I may attach a magnet on the bottom side of the carrier just to hold the shims in place if this trick does not work. And I'm not sure what size of a dowel I'm going to end up with a 1-inch custom bearing. With a 22mm bearing, I know that I can get a 1/2 inch. So we're going to do a quick test here and see if I'm getting close to 5/8 of an inch. So let's see what we've got here. Okay, so that's going to be 9/16. That may work. Actually, that size may work perfectly so that these don't get hung up. Alright, so we'll go with the 9/16 roughly that I've got set here. And so what I'll do is I'll take that 9/16 of an inch down an inch into this board, and then I'll cut another one right next to it. And then what I'll do is I'll readjust the bearing up here, put it in a different bearing so that I can cut a 3/8 inch radius on the outside here. I won't go down an inch with that. Okay, so now I'll do some readjustment to achieve a 3/8 inch radius out here on the end. Now I have the 15mm guide bearing installed as far back on the guide as it'll go. I'm thinking that this will give me a 3/8 inch dowel here on the end. I'm rethinking now that I actually want to make this end probably a 1/4 inch. We'll try to take it down to 3/8 first, and then once we get it down to 3/8, I'll take a look at it and see if I want to go to a 1/4 inch. We have here. And I've got 0.399, so that's actually just over 3/8 of an inch. And really, that doesn't look too bad. I think maybe what I'll do is I'll take that down to 3/8 of an inch, and then take another peek at it. Okay, now I've got 0.381. That's still just over 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to make one more adjustment here to see if I can get it down to 3/8 of an inch exactly. It's just a touch heavy. And I drilled the 3/8 inch hole a 1/2 inch deep using a Forstner bit, and so that left this slightly proud. I did cut it shorter than what it was originally, so it's probably about 5/8 of an inch long in total below this ridge. And so now I should be able to just set the stack of Dado shims on top of this, and should just drop right down and hold them securely. So I think that'll work out pretty well, and there's just enough room here so that it's not going to interfere with the box joints on the end. I have two nuts here turned into each other, and now I'm just using those to thread this 1/2 inch bolt into the board that's in the middle. Okay, it's making progress. Okay, it's almost through. Okay. That looks like that's all the way through. So now I just need to verify that it's not sticking out on either side. Okay, that is within a 32nd of an inch. On this side, got a little bit over a 32nd. That's probably close enough. So now I can do this other one the same way. So here are the finished dado stack carriers. For the Woodpeckers dado stack, I have the shims hidden right behind the two outside blades, and they're secured in place by the nut and the washer. For the Freud dado stack, I have the shims here in the bottom, held in place by the special dowel that we created earlier on the PantoRouter. So I'm very happy with the results here for both of these using the new 3/8 inch box joint templates. And I'm also happy with the results of the other set of box joints that were cut on the cabinet saw using the dado stack from Woodpeckers. Both of the carriers turned out pretty nice, so I'm happy with the results. Hey, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.